Hello chess friends and welcome to Jozarov chess channel and welcome back to the FTX Crypto Cup tournament in 2022. We're following now the round 3 of the Super-Event, and now in my opinion the derby of the day was the beautiful match between Levon Aronian and the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So we're diving in immediately into the first game of the day 3 between Levon Aronian and Magnus Carlsen. It was an incredible game already, and this game ended a couple minutes ago, so it was in my opinion really a tough battle. And here I think also Levon Aronian will show that actually he's trying to beat Magnus Carlsen. He's trying to show that he could maybe go into tactical battles against the world champion. So let's see now what happens. So as I said, this is now the first out of 4 games of the day 3 between Levon and Magnus Carlsen. So Levon opened with the move d4. We have e6 by Magnus Carlsen. We have knight to f3, knight to f6. So you see Magnus played the first move e6. He hoped maybe Levon goes into the French defense, because Magnus played now recently some wild ideas in the French also against Anish Giri. He won his game with the black pieces, so basically he invited now Levon to play, he dared him to play sort of the French defense. But after move knight to f3, the game transposed into the counter ninja or anti-ninja Indian setup here, after for maybe here the move c4, if of course that happens. Then here Levon Aronian chooses to play the move bishop to f4. The game transposes now into the London system, and I think most of us would continue something like this: d5, then e3, c5, c3, and we would reach, I think, the most common and most popular line of the London system. But here Magnus Carlsen played a beautiful idea with the move bishop to e7, and after move h3, this is also many times the normal idea to get some breathing spaces for the bishop. Now Magnus plays an interesting b5, and this is a way to go. I think this is a good move, which I would recommend you here to play, because white didn't play the move e3. White basically allowed this move b5, and basically, as we said, we want to play c5 here from black's perspective. We want to have an expansion here on the queen side with c4, b4, a5, a4. But look at this, the move b5 is already there, so you have already played aggressively on the queen side, so it's much more accurate, I think, to play the game like this. I really love now here Magnus Carlsen's choice, and actually it's already sort of a theoretical novelty. This position has not been reached in this particular move order exactly like this, but in the later stage of the game we'll see a couple of more games in the database that will collide now with this particular game. But as I said, so far a really interesting idea here by the world champion. So e3, we have a6, and now Magnus is playing c5 here without playing the first move d5 here. So after move knight to d2, now Magnus simply develops bishop to b7, and after bishop to d3, look at this really interesting idea here already, the move c5. So if you take, I think here, then you getting out of your normal ideas of the London system, then of course bishop to c5 is going to happen, and now you lost your firm center that you're building many times from white's perspective in the London. So that's why here Levon played, instead of this move d takes c5, he played the move c3, knight to c6. Magnus continues the pressure. Notice Magnus still didn't play it so far here with his d pawn. So we have now e4, and now finally d6. But I really love now Magnus Carlsen's expansion here already on the queen side, because this is the way to go. That's, I think, your only idea that you can produce in an early stage of the game from black's perspective, and here Magnus showed really already good game. So bishop to e3, kingside castling, and now rook to c8. Magnus continues here the pressure on the queen side. We have now d takes c5, and after d takes c5, the position is getting now symmetrical, which is, I think, perfectly fine here for black. One of the good defensive ideas in chess can be to create a symmetrical pawn structure where basically not so many things can happen, and so far also we have to notice the bishop is hanging here on d3. So that's why here Levon played queen to e2. We have queen to c7. The queens are getting out of the d file, because in the near future one of these rooks will come on the d file, and then your queen could be in danger. So we have now the move a4, which is, I think, a good choice here by Levon, because Magnus has here really an expansion on the queen side. That's the side where Magnus is better, so that's why here Levon is trying to undermine a little bit Magnus' attacks. But Magnus counterplays with c4, good expansion here on the queen side. We have bishop to c2, rook to d8, and now rook to d1 also by Levon, now competing against this rook on the d file. So we have now h6, creating some breathing spaces for the knight. Also, if for instance e5 could happen, in one moment of the game, not maybe immediately, then you have this idea, maybe knight to h7, knight to g5, reroute the knight, liberating maybe somehow even the bishop here is, I think, a good choice. So far I think Magnus is taking over already in the game here. In my opinion, I would love to play now more this game from black's perspective because of the better piece activity. I really love this bishop on this long diagonal, which is targeting here the g2 weakness. So we have 8x b5, 8x b5, b3. Levon is continuing with his defensive plan. He's trying to desperately undermine Magnus Carlsen's attack on the queen side. C takes b3, bishop to b3, and Magnus continues the pressure with the move b4. C takes b4, knight to b4, and now knight to d4 here, played by Levon Aronian. An interesting choice, of course. It is tempting maybe here to take out the knight here, the pawn on e4, but you get this one. This, I think, is the most important tactical shot, I think, that white is preparing here. This kind of a move, knight to e6. In this position, maybe it would work, but after move knight to d4 that Levon Aronian played here, Magnus didn't dare to play knight to e4 immediately. Probably was a little bit scared about this move knight to e6. That's why he played queen to e5, first improving a little bit his position of the queen of his minor pieces. We have now f4, and after queen to b8, now comes this tactical shot by Levon Aronian, knight takes e6, which is tempting, but you have to now make your point here with this tactical shot. It's still risky because this is an open game. Black is continuing the game with 4 minor pieces on the board. Quite risky here, a move by Levon Aronian. So we have f takes e6, bishop to e6. So now this line is forced, bishop to c8, rook to c8, and now Levon gets this rook on the 7th rank. Really nice here expansion also now on the queen side. So I'm not sure which position now I would love to play, because obviously this light square bishop is such a pain in the butt, sort of, here on this long diagonal. Probably Levon searching for opportunities how to get rid of the of this bishop on b7. So in my opinion, the main issue is still this e4 weakness, but also the f4 pawn could be a vulnerable piece. So if maybe Magnus grabs one of the centralized pawns, then black should be much better. So that's why bishop to c5. This is a good move, which I think gets rid of the key defender of white here on dark squares. Perfectly fine. We have bishop to c5, rook to c5, and now a rook to a1, battling here, of course, here on the a file, keeping all of the pieces glued together. So we have now knight to c6 by Magnus Carlsen, kicking away here the rook, but now Levon Aronian plays, of course, a counter attack, queen to e3, nice attack against the rook on c5. So we have here rook to c2, we have rook to a4, simply retreating with the piece, but also protecting the e4 pawn. We have queen to d8, knight to f3. So you see, Levon is now regrouping, searches now for new opportunities for his knight, and now after move knight to e7, here comes, in my opinion, the critical moment of the game. Here Levon Aronian played here queen to b3. The problem about this move queen to b3, that you have left a little bit your c1 unprotected. That's, I think, your weak square, sort of. Black could maybe build here some kind of a battery on the c file. Maybe here an idea, rook to b4. At least you're forcing your opponent to do something in this scenario. Maybe you can then double up on the b file, escape with the king on h2. Still, I kind of think this pawn on e4 is something that bothers now white in the continuation of the game. Even if you advance it, then you leave d5 weak, you're opening the diagonal. So still an unpleasant game, but this was, I think, a much better move, rook to b4. At least you're attacking something, at least you're making your opponent react. But now after move queen to b3, Magnus found a beautiful move, queen to c7, and he's threatening now a very annoying check, queen to rook to c1. Even if you try, I don't know, queen to e3, maybe to prevent this idea, then of course you get this one, rook to c3. You have to step back from the defense of the pawn here, quite unpleasant. So you see, still this pawn on e4 is, I think, a huge tactical problem. But okay, after move queen to c7, Levon went knight to d4, and now Magnus plays a beautiful move, rook to c1, rook to c1, queen to c1. After king to h2, now you see this pawn is lost, and in my opinion, this is now a much better continuation for Magnus Carlsen. This should should be probably a winning position. Here Levon has to play queen to g3, but now Magnus can also take out this pawn, and as I said, from this point on I would not love to play now anymore this game from White's perspective. So after queen to e4, here Levon tried rook to b4, attacking now the bishop on b7, which is quite a normal idea, but the pieces of blacks are perfectly coordinated, they're glued together, they're compact, so that's why Magnus' next couple of moves are really making sense. Bishop to d5, so you see he's gluing them more and more together where they cannot be attacked, and now Magnus is trying maybe to continue the pressure against maybe this weak pawn on g2. So we have now queen to f2, knight to g6. Magnus is trying to get knight on f4, where it can of course attack the g2 weakness. We have knight to c2, and now queen to e7 attacks also indirectly sort of the rook. One of the ideas can be maybe a deflection of the defensive knight on c2. So we have a rook to d4, bishop to e4, and now knight to e1. Levon Aronian is trying now to get some kind of drawish position. We have now queen to e5, getting a nice check. We have king to g1, and here the knight comes in a beautiful square on the square f4. So now again sort of an idea here by Levon Aronian. He played rook to b4. The problem I think about this rook is that you're getting many times the piece where you can maybe get some kind of a fork. Maybe you could also play here rook to c4, but still queen to e6 is going to happen. Now I think even some tactical shots could work. Knight takes h3, queen to h3, rook is hanging, so I'm not sure, but basically here black is leading the game, black is dominating now all over the board. So as we said, rook to b4 was played by Levon Aronian. Magnus escapes with the king, is not allowing any checks, really a calm, beautiful move. We have here now rook to b3, and now knight to d5, getting the knight here again in the center of the board. From this square it controls the c3 square, and now the e3 square. See, Magnus is getting closer and closer to the king. I would not love to play now really this game from White's perspective. I'm not sure how to even defend this position anymore. So knight to f3 was played by Levon Aronian, attacking the queen. We have queen to c7. What you don't want to play, I think, is bishop to f3, then rook to f3. It's quite hard now, I think, to win the game from black's perspective, although you have two knights against the rook. But the problem is now, if this game reaches maybe a position where you have only two knights against the king, that then you cannot of course deliver checkmate. So you should not forget about this when you're playing such an endgame. So that's why after move knight to f3, Magnus again kept it calm, retreated with the queen, but still you see how these pieces are really glued together, how they're coordinated in the center of the board. Queen to b2, we have queen to c5, a check, king to h2, maybe king to h1, at least slightly better. At least they're not getting on dark squares where you cannot be attacked again by the queen, but okay. King to h2, we have now knight to e3. Now this knight is coming on a beautiful square. Knight to f1 is also now a beautiful threat. So queen to d4, now comes this idea, knight to f1. We have king to h1. If you try of course king to g1, then you have this idea, knight to e2, the fork, and if it's of course game over. So that's why king to h1, but now Magnus simply traded off, and here this pawn is hanging, and this is now completely winning game for the world champion. So we have bishop to king to g1, bishop to h3. We have now rook to f3, attacking the knight, but now g5 again. Look how Magnus Carlsen is playing this endgame in a beautiful way. This is simply a Magnus Carlsen endgame, sort of. Only he can play, I think, the endgame stage like this. Knight to f4, again keeping all of the pieces glued together. So we have now rook to a3, king to g6, including now the king into the game. Knight to g3, we have a king to h2, and now knight to f5. So Magnus reroutes again the pieces, is trying to search for better squares. He's not rushing here. The cool part about this tournament is that you get increments, so you cannot lose on time if you're playing the game of course fast enough. So you don't have to play here the most accurate moves, but you're just rerouting the pieces, and as I said, searching for better squares. So rook to a6, a check, king to h5, knight to e5, we have a g4, rook to a3, and now bishop to f1. Now here the preparation is now an annoying g3, g2, maybe even then afterwards the move g1. So we have here rook to a4, g3, and now the knight comes on a beautiful square. Knight to d3, forcing a trades of knights. But here Levon Aronian is getting away from the attack, is trying to keep the pieces on the board, but now the knight is simply too far away from the action. We have bishop to h3, knight to f6, a check, not a problem. King to g6, we have knight to e4, attacking now the pawn on g3. Here we have knight to f4, really a nice move here by Magnus Carlsen, because there was maybe this idea, knight takes g3, but look how Magnus is sneaky here. Then you get knight to g3, you can maybe play rook takes f4, but now knight to e2 leads into a beautiful fork on e2. Really stunning tactical shot. So that's why Levon played rook to a6. He saw this tactical idea by Magnus. Magnus escapes here on h5. Here we have knight to f6, the check. King to h4, no checks are possible now. We have this idea, rook to a4, attacking now the knight. King to g5, we have knight to e4, king to g4, after knight to c3, and knight to h4. In this position, Levon Aronian resigns. So now the obvious threat is of course g2 and then knight to f3. There is no good way anymore to escape from this idea in this position. As we said, Levon Aronian resigned. So really beautiful game by the world champion Magnus Carlsen. It was risky by Levon to sacrifice the pawn on e6. Maybe in a longer time format this could work, but with not so many minutes on the clock, it's so hard to play against this minor pieces. The minor pieces of Magnus Carlsen started to dance all over the board. You have always the threats to get some kind of a fork or something, to get maybe an X-ray attack or something. So it's quite hard just to play only with the rooks on the board. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. Interesting ideas of the London system. If you have trouble, maybe you can apply this B5 system by Magnus Carlsen. Really cool game so far they played in the round 1. So okay, we'll follow I think more of this super event today. So far it has been great, a great start by the world champion Magnus Carlsen, but still Levon has of course also some chances maybe to make something in this match. Okay, see you soon with some more games, and as I always like to say, chess is the best, of course.